Emmett Vane thought he had built something that could not be broken. He ran a sawmill operation out of Harlan County, Oregon. 300 acres of timber land. A mill that had been cutting since his father's time. And a crew of 11 men who had learned not to ask questions he didn't want to answer. The mill ran the way it had always run, which was by feel and by habit and by the quiet authority of a man who had spent 20 years learning every board foot of that land by walking it himself. Emmett did not keep detailed records. He did not consult outside opinion. He did not explain his decisions to anyone, because no one had ever asked him to explain anything, and he did not see why they should start. Then his brother's daughter arrived from Philadelphia with a leather satchel and 3 days to settle her late father's estate, looked at his ledgers for one afternoon, and told him he was losing money on every contract he had signed in the last 4 years. Emmett Vane laughed at her. He was a timberman. She was a solicitor's assistant from the East who had never run a chainsaw in her life. What could she possibly know about his operation? Within the week he had stopped laughing. Within the week, Adelaide Morse had done what no county assessor, no bank officer and no business partner had ever done. She had taken his entire operation apart, piece by piece, and shown the man who thought he had built something unbreakable exactly where the cracks were. She did not shout. She did not demean him. She did something considerably worse to a man of his particular pride. She was right about everything, and she had the documents to prove it. I have been collecting stories from the American West for a long time, and what I have found is this: the most dangerous thing a proud man can do is confuse stubbornness with strength. Emmett Vane was not a bad man. He was not a dishonest man. He was, by every account of everyone who worked for him, a fair and loyal and hard-working man. He was also, as Adelaide Morse would demonstrate with quiet and devastating precision, a man who had been walking in the wrong direction for 4 years without once stopping to check the compass. This is the story of the week she checked it for him. Adelaide Morse was 34 years old, and had grown up inside the machinery of legal paperwork the way other children grow up inside barns or kitchens. Her father, Emmett's older brother Nathaniel, had been a land solicitor in Philadelphia for 22 years. She had spent her childhood in his office, and by the time she was 16, she could read a contract faster than most men twice her age, could spot an ambiguous clause at 50 paces, and understood that the difference between a good agreement and a ruinous one was almost never dramatic. It was almost always in the fine print that nobody read because they trusted the man across the table. She had not planned to go into law herself, she had planned to teach. But Nathaniel had taken sick in the winter of 1887, and the work had needed doing, and Adelaide had done it, and then gone on doing it because she was, as her father had always told her, better at it than anyone he had ever trained. When Nathaniel died the following spring, he left behind a small practice, a modest house, 2 clients, and a partial ownership stake in a timber operation in Harlan County, Oregon, that he had accepted as payment for a land dispute he had helped resolve 8 years prior. Adelaide had never been west of Pittsburgh. She had met Emmett Vane exactly once, at a family gathering in 1881, and her memory of him was of a large, quiet man who had said almost nothing the entire afternoon and left early without explanation. She could have sold the stake by post. She had a standing offer from a mill broker in Portland, who had written her 3 times since Nathaniel's death, each letter slightly more eager than the last, which was itself a signal she recognized from her father's training. When a buyer is eager, her father used to say, the seller has not yet understood what they are holding. So Adelaide did what her father had taught her. She went to see the thing herself. Emmett Vane met her at the station in Medford. He was 41, broad-shouldered, and visibly uncomfortable in the way that men are uncomfortable when they have agreed to something they immediately regret. He had loved his brother in the distant, uncommunicative way of men who express affection through practical things, by remembering a birthday with a crate of good apples, by showing up unannounced when someone needed a roof repaired. He had not known how to mourn Nathaniel, so he had done what he always did with feelings he couldn't manage. He had put them somewhere he couldn't reach and gone back to work. He had assumed Adelaide would take one look at the mud and the timber smell and the relentless gray of an Oregon spring, and want nothing more than to sign whatever needed signing and be back on the eastbound train inside 48 hours. He had mentally prepared a number, low but not insultingly so, and was ready to offer it before she had finished unpacking. He was, as it happened, wrong on every count. The drive from Medford to the mill was 40 minutes of mostly silence, with the road winding up through stands of Douglas fir so tall they turned the afternoon light into something almost green. Adelaide watched the trees and asked 2 questions. The first was about the road. The second was about water rights. Both questions were precise enough that Emmett glanced at her sideways, the way a man does when he realizes the conversation he prepared for is not the one he is about to have. That first evening, while Emmett was out walking the yard with his foreman, Adelaide did what came naturally to her. She sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger books she had found on the shelf beside the window. 3 of them, each marked by year in Emmett's careful but sparse handwriting. And she read them. By the time Emmett came back in from the dark, she had found the first problem. By 10 o'clock she had found 3 more. By midnight, Adelaide Morse understood that she had not inherited a partial stake in a functioning mill. She had inherited a partial stake in an operation that was being slowly consumed from the inside by 4 contracts that should never have been signed, a pricing structure that had not been updated in 7 years, and a cost ledger so incomplete that it was less a financial record than an optimistic suggestion. She did not wake Emmett. She finished her notes. Then she made a cup of tea and sat for a while with the ledgers open around her, and she thought about what it meant to work very hard at a thing for a very long time, and still be losing ground, and not know it, because the thing you were working hard at had become so familiar you could no longer see it clearly. She had seen it before, not with timber, with people. On the first morning, she asked Emmett to walk the operation with her. He agreed the way men agree to things they consider humoring, with the tolerance of someone who has somewhere more important to be. They walked for most of the day. Adelaide asked questions the entire time, and they were not the questions he had expected. She did not ask about board feet or grades of lumber or the mechanics of the saw rig. She asked about contracts, about delivery timelines, about the rate per thousand he had agreed to with the 3 buyers whose names she had noted from the ledger. Emmett could not answer most of them. He knew the timber the way you know old country by feel and memory, and the 1,000 small things that cannot be written down. He knew which stands were worth cutting this season, and which ones needed another 10 years. He knew which part of the creek ran clean enough for the boiler, and which stretch had silt problems after the spring thaw. He knew his crew by their work and by their trouble, and by what they needed without being asked. But the contracts, the rates, the cost per log against the price per board, those he had left to a bookkeeper who had quit 3 years ago and had not been replaced, because Emmett had assumed, in the way that confident men assume things that are not true, that he could manage well enough on his own. That evening, Adelaide set it out across the kitchen table the way her father used to lay out evidence before a closing argument. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just organized so that the truth of the thing had nowhere to hide. The 3 largest contracts he was currently running, she told him, had been priced in 1880. The cost of labor had risen since then, the cost of replacement parts for the saw rig had risen. The fuel for the boiler had risen. The price he was charging per 1,000 board feet had not moved in 7 years. Because the buyers were satisfied with the arrangement, and Emmett had not thought to renegotiate. And the buyers had not volunteered to suggest he should. He was not running a mill at a profit. He was running a mill at a loss and covering it with the reserves his father had left, which were nearly gone, and which Emmett had categorized in his own mind as a kind of buffer against bad seasons, rather than what they actually were, which was the only thing standing between the operation and insolvency. Emmett sat across the table from her and said nothing for a long time. Then he said the contracts had always been structured that way, and the buyers were men he trusted, and it was not the kind of country where you renegotiated a handshake. Adelaide looked at him. She said, "I understand that. But Emmett, a handshake is an agreement between 2 people in good faith. If the terms of that agreement have changed in a way that only benefits one party, it is not a handshake anymore. It is just a habit, and habits are not the same as loyalty." He did not answer that, but he did not leave the table. On the second day she looked at the crew. Not their character. She had no opinion about their character. She was looking at the labor cost against the output, which told a story that the men themselves would not have wanted known. 2 of them were being carried, not out of cruelty, out of the same quality that ran through everything she had seen in Emmett Vane's operation, which was loyalty that had not stopped to ask whether it was still serving anyone. One was an older man named by everyone as simply Decker, who had worked the mill since Emmett's father's time. The other was a young man who had been taken on as a favor to a neighboring family after the father broke his hip, with the understanding that it was temporary, and which had extended now into its 3rd year because nobody had said the word temporary out loud again. She found something else on the second day, a supply arrangement with a hardware merchant in Medford who was invoicing Emmett for materials, at a rate that was, by her calculation, somewhere between 30 and 40% above the going rate. She cross-referenced it with 2 other suppliers she found named in the older ledger, and the discrepancy was not subtle. It had just never been noticed because Emmett paid his bills without checking them, the way a man pays a toll without asking who built the road. Emmett defended all of it, at first. Decker had earned his place. The young man was getting better. The Medford merchant was a neighbor and a decent man, and this was not the kind of country where you accused a neighbor of anything. Adelaide did not argue the point about Decker. She liked the sound of him actually, from the way Emmett talked about the older man. She said, "I'm not asking you to let him go. I'm asking you to stop pretending he's a full-wage worker when he isn't, because the fiction is costing you money and it isn't actually helping him either. If you want to keep him on, keep him on. Pay him what the work is worth and call it what it is, which is that you are choosing to support a man who has served your family well. That is an honorable thing. Just don't hide it in the labor column and then wonder why the numbers don't balance. As for the merchant, she showed him the invoices. She did not editorialize. She let the numbers say what they said, which was that someone had been relying for a long time on a customer who did not read his bills. On the third day she found what was underneath all of it. The mill was not just a business. It was the specific shape that Emmett's grief had taken. His father had built the first saw rig on this land in 1861. His father had run the operation for 27 years. And when he died he had left it to Emmett with the kind of wordless expectation that fathers leave things to eldest sons, which is to say not a will so much as an assumption. Emmett had taken it on at the age of 32, as though the weight of it were a natural condition of his body. The way a man carries a scar without noticing it anymore. He had not changed a single fundamental thing about the operation since his father died. Not because the old ways were best, though he believed they were, but because changing them felt, in some part of himself he had never examined, like erasing the man. The 3 old contracts were the contracts his father had signed. The pricing structure was his father's pricing structure. Even the way the logs were staged in the yard. The specific arrangement, the specific order of operations, was the arrangement his father had preferred, which had made sense on equipment that was now 10 years out of date and made considerably less sense on the newer rig that Emmett had installed 6 years ago without adjusting any of the surrounding process to match it. He was running a 1878 operation inside a 1888 machine, and he had called it tradition. Adelaide understood this immediately, because she had just spent a year administering her father's estate, and she knew exactly what it felt like to touch every part of a dead man's work and have it feel like touching the man. She had left her father's desk exactly where it was in the office for 4 months after he died, and had worked standing up rather than move it. She did not say any of this. She was not in the habit of explaining her inner reasoning to men who had not asked for it. What she said was, "Your father was a smart man, you told me that this morning, and I believe you, because what he built here was genuinely good. It worked for a long time in the conditions it was designed for." She paused. "Emmett, the conditions changed, the cost changed, the market changed. None of that is a reflection on your father. It is just time doing what time does. The question is whether you honor the man by preserving the exact form of what he built, or whether you honor him by making sure the thing he built survives." Emmett sat with that for a long time. On the 4th day he stopped defending himself. He sat at the kitchen table each evening and listened while Adelaide worked through the numbers, and something in the quality of his listening changed. It was not surrender. It was something closer to what happens when a man has been carrying a weight wrong for a long time, straining against it in a way that is exhausting without being efficient, and someone shows him how to shift the load. The weight does not get lighter, but the carrying gets possible again. Adelaide noticed something else on the 4th day. She noticed because she noticed things. The way he moved through the yard with his men. The way they followed him not because he told them to but because they wanted to. She noticed the way he had built the equipment shed so it faced south, which she worked out was because the older hands had trouble with cold hands in the mornings, and the south-facing wall held the overnight warmth an hour longer than any other. He had not mentioned this. It was just a thing he had done. She noticed a small wooden horse on the shelf in the mill office. Painted, well-made, obviously old. The kind a child would have. She did not ask about it. But she noticed that he touched it once, briefly when he thought she wasn't looking. The way people touch things they can't say anything about. She wrote nothing about these things in her working notes. But she held them in a different kind of account. On the 5th evening, the work was nearly done. Adelaide had a plan. It was not complicated, which was one of the things she knew about plans, which was that the good ones never were. Renegotiate all 3 major contracts. The buyers would not like it, but they were not going to walk away from the only mill in the county, and they had been profiting from his inattention long enough that a fair renegotiation was not extortion. It was correction. Find a new hardware supplier, or present the current one with a competitive quote, and let him decide whether he wanted the business at an honest rate. Restructure the crew. Pension Decker at a figure that reflected his actual service rather than his nominal wage. Let the temporary arrangement become official with a reduced scope or end it. Update the staging process in the yard to match the actual equipment. Within 18 months, she calculated, the operation would be solvent. Within 3 years, if the timber market held, it would be profitable enough to reinvest. Emmett looked at the plan for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "My brother used to say the sharpest person he'd ever worked with. I thought it was just that he'd spent too much time in an office and hadn't met enough people." He paused. He was right, and I owe him an apology for doubting him. Adelaide looked down at her notes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nathaniel saw clearly. That was his particular gift. He saw what things were worth before other people had gotten around to valuing them." She stopped. "He saw something worth keeping in me when I was 17 years old, and angry about everything, and convinced that careful thinking was a consolation prize for people who couldn't do anything interesting. He was patient with me until I figured out that careful thinking was the most interesting thing there was. They sat in the kitchen with the lamp burning low. Two people who had both loved the same man, who had come to this table as strangers and had, over 5 days of numbers and hard conversations, arrived somewhere else entirely. It was not romance. Not yet. It was the particular honesty that happens between two people who have nothing to perform for each other. Because the weak has already stripped away every pretense and left only what is actually there. On the frontier, or anywhere really, that kind of honesty is usually the beginning of something. On the 6th day, Adelaide was supposed to leave. The work was done. The plan was written. She had come to examine an asset, and she had done that with considerably more thoroughness than either of them had anticipated. The practical thing was to negotiate the purchase of her stake at a fair value, take the train back to Philadelphia, and return to the practice her father had left her. She packed her satchel, she packed her case. She was standing in the front room waiting for Emmett to bring the wagon around when she looked at the shelf in the hallway and saw a photograph she had not noticed before. It was Nathaniel, young, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize with Emmett beside him, both of them squinting into the sun. Nathaniel was laughing. Emmett had his hand on his brother's shoulder. It was the only photograph in the room. She stood looking at it until she heard the wagon outside. The drive to Medford was different from the drive out. They had spent a week learning to talk, and the road that had been 40 minutes of silence going one direction was 40 minutes of something else going the other way. They talked about the contracts. About which of the buyers was most likely to push back. About the question of the hardware supplier, and whether it was better to confront him directly, or simply send a competing quote and let the arithmetic speak for itself. They talked about Nathaniel. As the town came into view, both of them went quiet, the way people go quiet when the end of something is close enough to feel. At the station, Emmett lifted her case onto the platform. He said, "You came out here to look at a piece of a mill and I gave you one night with a set of broken ledgers. You turned it into something I've been needing for 4 years. I don't know how to account for that." Adelaide said, "You account for it by doing the plan. Don't let the old habits talk you back into the old ways the day after I leave." He said, "And your stake? Do you want to sell it back to me?" Adelaide Morse, daughter of a land solicitor, trained from childhood to make no decision without examining the evidence, made the one decision of that week that could not be reached by examination. She said no. Emmett waited. She said, "My father had one rule: never dispose of something you haven't fully understood. I have spent 5 days understanding this operation. The land, the crew, the equipment, the contracts." She paused. "The man who runs it." She looked at him directly the way she had been looking at him all week, without softening the edges. "The most valuable thing in this operation is not the timber and it is not the contracts and it is not the equipment. It is a man who built a tool shed facing south because his older hands have cold mornings, and who keeps a painted wooden horse on a shelf in the mill office and has never told a single person why." She stopped. "I am not selling my stake, Emmett. I am staying on it if you'll have me. Not as Nathaniel's sister, as your partner. In the operation and in everything else if that's what you want." The train whistle blew somewhere behind her. Emmett Vane, who had said almost nothing to this woman on the first day because he had nothing to say, found that he still had nothing to say and that it did not matter. He picked up her case and carried it back to the wagon. Adelaide watched him do it. She understood the answer completely, because by that point she understood him completely, in the way that you can only understand a person after you have examined every part of what they have built and seen what it cost them and seen what it is still worth. They were married that fall. The county found it peculiar, and the county said so, because the county always did. A Philadelphia solicitor's assistant and a timber man who had never been east of the Cascades. Nobody could quite account for how it had happened. Adelaide did not offer an explanation. She had learned from her father that people who needed things explained to them were generally not asking because they wanted to understand. They were asking because they wanted to be reassured that the world was what they expected it to be. Adelaide was not in the business of that kind of reassurance. She ran the contracts, Emmett ran the timber. Within 3 months all 3 major contracts had been renegotiated. The buyers had pushed back as she had expected, and she had let them push, also as she had expected. And then she had shown each of them, politely and without any particular urgency, the competitive rates available from 2 other mills in the state that were closer to railheads than Emmett's operation but could not match it on quality or reliability. The contracts settled at figures that were fair to both parties, which meant they were considerably better for Emmett than they had been. The hardware merchant in Medford received a comparative, quote, 3 weeks. Adelaide arrived back on the property as a permanent resident. He came down to a reasonable rate within the same week, which told her everything she needed to know about what he had known and when he had known it. Decker stayed on, at a figure that was honest and that Emmett paid openly rather than shuffled into the general labor column, because Adelaide had been right that the fiction wasn't helping anyone. The old man accepted it without comment, which was his way, and continued to do what he had always done, which was show up every morning knowing more about the wood in the machine than any man half his age. The yard was restaged. The process was updated. Emmett learned it over the course of about 3 weeks, with the same stubborn patience he brought to everything difficult, which was to do it wrong repeatedly until he understood why it was wrong, and then never do it wrong again. Within 2 years the Vane mill was running at a profit for the first time in longer than Emmett had realized. Within 5 it was one of the most efficient operations in the county, studied by other mill owners who could not understand how a mid-size spread was out-earning larger operations with more timber access. The answer was that Emmett's wife read contracts, and contracts like ledgers did not lie. The painted wooden horse on the shelf in the mill office had belonged to Emmett's younger brother, Nathaniel, who had carried it west from their childhood home in Ohio at the age of 9, and then left it behind when he went east again at 17 to study law. Emmett had kept it for 24 years without mentioning it to anyone. Adelaide found this out from Decker, who had been there long enough to know the stories that didn't get told. She moved the horse to a shelf in the house where she could see it from the kitchen table. Emmett did not say anything about the move, but he did not move it back. He ran the operation until 1919, when his health required him to hand the daily management to their son and daughter, both of whom could read a contract before they could ride, because Adelaide had made certain of that. Emmett died in the spring of 1922 at 72, with the operation in better condition than it had been when he inherited it, which was the thing he had wanted more than anything, and had not known how to achieve until someone sat down across a kitchen table and showed him the numbers. Adelaide outlived him by 9 years. She kept the books herself until she was 73, and when she finally allowed her daughter to take them over, she did so with a list of instructions that ran to 11 pages, which her daughter later said was the most useful document she had ever read. They kept the horse on the shelf in the house. It is still there, in the account of this story at least, in the version that got passed down through the county and eventually found its way to me. I think about Emmett Vane sometimes when I am looking at something I have been doing a long time. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes from competence. You get good at a thing and the getting good becomes its own justification. And you stop asking whether the thing you are good at is still the right thing to be doing. You call it experience. Sometimes it is. And sometimes it is just the long shadow of a man you loved, and you have been standing in it so long you forgot the light was coming from somewhere else. The kindest thing Adelaide Morse ever did for Emmett Vane was not saving his mill. It was sitting across that kitchen table and refusing to look away from what the numbers were saying, even when looking at them was painful for both of them. That is the most useful thing one person can do for another. See clearly, say it plainly, stay at the table. I want to know something from you. What is the thing you are still running the old way? Not because the old way is working, but because changing it would mean admitting that the person who taught it to you was wrong, or that the time for it has passed. Leave it in the comments. And if you want another story about a woman who looked at something everyone else had stopped seeing, the next one is already waiting.